We're continuing this morning in the stewardship series that Pastor Chris started us in last September. And in typical Andrew fashion, I didn't make any slides. I'm sorry, just a black screen for you today. As Chris has gone through this series over the past year, the emphasis has been on the idea of stewarding all of the things that God has given us. Stewarding all things that God has given us, which are all of the things that we may have. Referencing, I didn't write down the Psalm reference, it just says the Psalm, which says that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And so we've been learning how to steward or care for or properly handle the things that God has made and given to us. And this fall and heading into the new year, we'll be looking at stewarding our family, stewarding relationships, both within our marriages, with our kids, but also with our siblings and our parents. And ultimately, I think as well, within this family, this gathering of believers. So far, Chris has done 5 sermons looking at masculinity and femininity, and I have done 1 sermon on singleness. And this morning, I've been asked to look at dating. So that's fun. Dating is one of those topics that I actually spend a lot of time thinking about, reading about, and talking to people about because I'm a youth pastor, and teenagers date. Lots of them do. Not all of them. The wise ones don't, but lots of them do. Lots of them do. And so I give a lot of thought and time to what they need to know and how I can enter into those spaces well and with wisdom to provide for them. And as I prepared this, I thought I don't just want to speak to the teenagers or the young people in the room who might be dating. I want to keep in mind that these principles, that these approaches, that these things about relationship we're going to look at today apply to all of our relationships. They apply to all of the relationships that we're having, both within our romantic relationships, our family relationships, as well as our friend groups and our gatherings here. Some of these principles will apply across the board, but we are going to emphasize and focus on dating. And before we get too far down the rabbit hole of looking specifically at dating, we need to set a couple of foundational theological points. The first one is one that Chris has been hammering on for the last several weeks, and that is that we are made in the image of God. In the image of God, He created them. So we are made in the image of God. This is the first important foundational belief that we have to hold on to in order to talk about dating. And it's important because each person has intrinsic value and worth. And that intrinsic value and worth is attached to their creation, to the image bearing that they carry in the name that they carry. Wow. So the first important principle, foundational piece, is that we are made in the image of God. Not just the self, not just that I'm made in the image of God, but any person that I interact with and enter into a relationship with is also made in the image of God. Therefore, that person is an image bearer of God's image. They are a person of intrinsic value and worth, and they need to be treated as such. Far too often I run into young people looking to date because they want to experience romance, intimacy, or not be alone anymore. And I ask them, does it matter to you who you date? I'll ask them that sometimes. And they'll say, no, I just need someone. And I'm like, at that point, so somehow I bring in the challenge, try to do it gently. But I just go, at some point, you're just treating the other person as an object to fulfill your need, rather than treating them like a real person, worthy of love and respect and having intrinsic value and worth. You're no longer treating them as an image bearer of God, but you're treating them like an object to fill the hole in your own life, whatever that might be. That theme will come up a couple more times this morning. The second important foundational truth that we need to just quickly remind ourselves of is that we are people made for relationship. God designed humanity to be relational beings. We see this very clearly in Genesis chapter 2, but we see it in our own lives. We see it all throughout the biblical narrative. We are people designed for relationship. Now, that does not necessarily mean that we are all designed for marriage. I just gave a sermon on that 2 weeks ago. Go check that out. Okay? But we are designed for relationship. We're designed for relationship with one another. We're designed for a relationship ultimately with God. And we are designed actually for relationship with ourselves as well. And that's a more recent psychological thing in terms of, not recent to theology, but recent in psychology. They're just realizing how important that is. And I'm like, just catching up with Christians, psychologists. But we are people designed for relationship. We are meant to be in meaningful relationships with one another and with the God who made us, right? I talk about this topic a lot, maybe more in youth group. Obviously, I don't preach as often, so maybe you don't hear me talk about it a lot. But the word I usually use for this is shalom, right? It's the Hebrew word that means peace, but really the true understanding of this word shalom is whole, healthy, and complete relationship. And it is God's design and intention for all of creation that we exist in shalom, in relationship with one another and with God, right? It's actually on the back of my hoodie today is my little shalom diagram thing about relationship. So we are supposed to be a people of relationship, and each person in those relationships are people of worth and value. But I don't have to probably push too hard to find out from all of you that relationships are hard. Relationships are painful. Relationships often don't go the way we want them to. Every one of us has experienced hurt in our lives, and every one of us likely has felt that hurt through or because of a relationship. Whether you've been hurt by a parent, a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor, a coach, a friend, a babysitter, a pastor, another member of the church. We've all experienced the pain of hurt, of betrayal, of abandonment, of loss, of failure, of invasion. And yet we continue to pursue relationship because we know fundamentally we are designed for it. We are meant to be people of relationship, and yet relationships don't always go so smoothly. Ever since Genesis 3, basically, relationship has fallen apart. I usually blame Adam for that, because there's that whole moment, right? We're not going to go deep into Genesis 3 today, but there's that whole moment where Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit, right? And then God shows up and he's like, "What have you done?" And Adam's like, "The woman that you gave me." And there's pretty much the end of relationship working out well for the rest of human history. But we've all experienced pain, betrayal, and abandonment, loss and failure in context of relationship. So we have this problem. Relationships are necessary for human flourishing, for human thriving, because we are made to be people of relationship, and yet relationships are difficult and painful. And so in order to have a healthy relationship, we need to develop a key ingredient, and that key ingredient is maturity. Now, the harsh, brutal, double-edged sword of this is that maturity is developed in relationship. So in order to have good relationship, we need maturity. In order to get maturity, we need relationships. So that's fun. Developing maturity is something that we experience or happens as we experience relationship. One author wrote on the topic of dating that dating is an experience that requires maturity, and therefore they have a rule: no kids allowed. But by that, they don't mean age. They mean maturity. That you are not to enter dating or romantic relationships with a childish or self-centered mindset. I'm personally one who, when I speak on dating at youth group, which is usually about 3 to 4 messages a year, I usually do them in February, quite on purpose because Valentine's Day is in there. And I usually do 3 to 4 messages, and each one is about 40 to 45 minutes long. And I'm going to condense them all into just this morning. Maybe not all of them, not all the details, but we're going to get into them. And I usually tell the teenagers I'm not against them dating, but I am against them dating foolishly or without wisdom. I'm not a fan of how the current culture of dating is all about getting what you can out of another person. I'm not a fan of hearing things like, well, I just sort of ended up dating this person. I'm like, well, where did the intentionality come from? Like, where did that come from? You know, you have a freedom to choose. Or I don't understand what happened in the relationship. It just kind of fell apart on me. Or I didn't mean to hurt that person, but they got hurt. And it's like you have a responsibility in that relationship. Most, if not all, of the problems in dating can be narrowed down to a problem of freedom and responsibility. And this applies to actually marriages as well. Most things about dating apply to marriages, by the way. Not everything, but most things. So maybe you'll get something for your marriage out of this too. Most of the problems in dating and in most relationships actually get narrowed down to the problem of freedom and responsibility. Freedom in this case, I'm referring to as being able to make choices based on value and on your values rather than on shame and guilt. Shame and guilt rob us of the ability to make choices based on the values we actually hold to or hold dear. Most of us are led by our feelings of shame or guilt. In fear of feeling shame for something we did it before, or fear of feeling pain in a way we have once before, we make choices to avoid it. Or we choose to make no choice, which is a choice of its own, and find ourselves trying to avoid pain and suffering. This is actually the emphasis of programs like Freedom Session, right? It even has the word freedom right in it. Thought that was pretty convenient. Freedom Session is a program we've run at Brightview here a handful of times. And it explores this exact issue, that most of us have some degree of guilt or shame around areas of failure, abandonment, or loss of self. We get defensive or angry when these areas get poked, and we turn to drugs of choice to medicate or retreat from the pain. Sometimes dating becomes a drug of choice. Sometimes people enter into dating relationships in order to avoid feeling pain or in order to medicate their pain for a short period of time. Once again, using the other person as a sort of remedy to their own failure or their own wounds. Or sometimes what people might feel as they enter into a relationship is that they have no choices. That I didn't have a choice in this situation. If I chose something, then they might leave me and I'd be alone again. Or they didn't give me a choice. An important rule of dating and of relationships in general is that you have the freedom to choose, and that you must take hold of that freedom to choose and choose according to what is valuable, to what your values are, rather than to what the words of shame and guilt and fear are saying to you. Les and Leslie Perot are a Christian couples counselors. They provide a lot of marriage resources and counseling resources for pastors, including the one I use for pre-marriage counseling. And they defined relationships as two broken people coming together to form one broken relationship. We often want to define relationship as two broken people coming together and becoming healthy. And now you might go on a journey of becoming healthy and you might get healthier, but generally when you have two broken things come together, you have two broken things. And if you can combine them, it becomes one broken thing. Les and Leslie Perot state that a relationship is only as healthy as the least healthy person in the relationship. They explain that as each person individually gets healthier, so also does the whole relationship. Most of us, however, choose to be in denial about our health, about our mental health, about our well-being, but especially about what it is that drives our choice making. Most of us like to pretend like the choices we had to make are the choices we had to make. And we don't like to get honest about the choices we could have made or the choices we can make that are in front of us. We avoid working on our past wounds and dealing with the shame and guilt in our lives because it might just be too painful. And what if people don't like me afterwards? We avoid working on it and we try to keep the past in the past. But in doing so, we ignore or miss how much our pasts are truly hurting and affecting us today. I appreciate that in the New Testament, Paul explains that we are a new creation in Christ. And we like to focus on that sometimes. That's in Colossians 3 and in 1 Corinthians as well, 2 Corinthians as well. But I've been focusing a lot recently with our youth group in John. In John chapter 3, Jesus says, the light came into the world, but the world loved the darkness. And I wonder sometimes if the process of becoming a new creation is a process of allowing light to shine in dark areas of our lives. Is allowing the dark to be exposed, to be eliminated. And that is a scary and painful process. It says in John 3 that light came into the world, but the people loved darkness because their deeds were evil. We often choose to live in the darkness, and we don't want the light to penetrate. But then we wonder, why do I feel like I never have a choice? Why do I always feel like I have to act this way? Or why do I keep choosing what I don't want to choose? I think at some point we need to allow the light to shine in darkness. You have the freedom to make choices, and even making no choice is a choice. And in dating, this can sometimes be difficult as we see the potential for the loss of relationship. Feel like our hands are tied, robbing us of the choice to leave or even to set boundaries. Dating can be a process of maturing us, but ultimately we need to address our unhealth. The good thing about dating and any relationship actually is that there's a good chance that that relationship will help to expose the things that we've been hiding. Things that we bury down tend to become more exposed the closer you become with another person. The second important feature of a healthy dating this isn't under health yet. We're under problems in dating still. The other important factor, number one problem in dating, is responsibility. So freedom, people have freedom to choose, but many don't allow themselves that freedom because of guilt and shame. The second is responsibility. This refers to your ability to execute your part in making the relationship healthy and loving, while also saying no to the things that you should not be responsible for. This is appropriate and healthy boundary setting. This is the responsibility part where God comes up to Adam and goes, "What have you done?" And Adam should have probably said something like, "I ate the fruit. And I allowed Eve to eat the fruit first because I didn't want to die first." You know, like he could have just owned that moment, right? Like, I screwed up. But instead he moves straight to blame. It's everybody else's fault but mine. I'm not responsible for this. She handed me the fruit. I ate it. I don't know what you want me to do about that. You gave her to me. Your problem, right? Like, wow. Blame, passing responsibility, and not taking responsibility for self. One author I read this week, talked about or described the role of responsibility kind of like being a property owner. Described it as the idea of property lines. Your life is, to some degree, your property. And you have these property lines that you need to set up. And it's your responsibility to take care of the things inside of your property line, to maintain your house, to maintain your yard. That's your responsibility. It's your job to make sure that your house is in order. So that when you enter into a relationship, you have the capacity and the ability to take on the responsibility of also caring for your part in the relationship. A lot of us, unfortunately, try to shirk our responsibility. We avoid, we blame, we hide, or we look to the other person to carry the weight of the relationship. They need to do that work. And we'll come up with excuses and reasons why. But we need to learn to take responsibility for our lives and for our relationships. Now, dating is a very unique type of relationship. It is developed in our culture to bridge the gap between friendship and marriage, with an intent to explore the viability of a long-term romantic relationship. By its nature, the dating relationship is experimental. and has a low level of commitment, especially in the early stages. Due to this experimental nature and low commitment, dating provides some major risks. Now, it should be noted, every relationship comes with risk. Just showing up here on a Sunday morning has a certain degree of risk. What will people think of me? How should I, what happens if they don't like the way I dressed? Don't worry, you're probably dressed better than me, right? I just wear a hoodie. It was like that one, this is an aside, but that one morning where I was going golfing after church, and so I wore my golf clothes, which is like a polo with a collar. Shocked some people. Shocked. They were like, whoa, you have a shirt with a collar? I was like, yeah, I do. Just one. I use it for disc golfing, not for church. Anyways, that's a weird aside, and you can challenge me on that later. Talk about developing maturity, right? Anyways. Can't let my brain just go on these tangents. Okay. All relationships contain risk. All of them. Friendships, sibling relationships, parents and children. The greater the commitment, the greater the risk. The greater the commitment, the greater the risk of heartbreak, of abandonment, of being wounded and hurt. The greater the importance of the relationship, the greater the risk of loss. We always carry risk when we enter relationships. I talked with a young man at a camp this summer. He was one of the volunteer staff at the summer camp. And he came to me and he said, there's this girl I really like. She's also working here at camp this summer. And I was wondering your thoughts. Should I ask her out? I was like, it's kind of a weird question in a sense. I don't know you. I don't know this girl. Should is a weird way to ask it. But I said, well, what's holding you up? Like, why do you feel you need to come ask me? And he said, I'm just not sure. Like, what if she says no? And I said, that's a risk that every relationship has. And every relationship has risk. You need to determine whether you're ready to risk something. And I said, I think you should risk something for the sake of relationship because generally it's worth it. However, I don't know you or this girl, so, your call. I think he did ask her out later. I don't know what happened. He was waiting till camp was over. And that was wise because he didn't want it to be a distraction from his job. But it's an interesting question. Relationships require us to take significant risks. We know that entrusting ourselves emotionally to another person, even a little bit, is risky. It could be that the other person who you've entrusted that little bit of yourself to, even if it's only a small amount, could choose to take that little bit of you and just throw it on the ground and stomp on it a bit. It's incredibly painful. Many of us, I would say probably all of us, have experienced that in some way in our lives. And so when we enter into the dating relationship, we're entering into a risky relationship. One where we are entrusting ourselves somewhat emotionally into the hands of another person, maybe not entirely yet. That's kind of what marriage is meant to be. And yet, to some degree, we're entrusting some of ourselves emotionally into the hands of another person with the great risk that they might just throw it on the ground and stomp on it. Dating is a temporary relationship with low commitment. And that comes with high risk. As a result, I've developed, I personally, not really, through a lot of reading, I've stolen 3 sort of rules or approaches, or what I call often boundaries for dating, which I think apply in broad to most relationships, but especially and specifically to dating. And as many young people in our church are dating, and as many of you have maybe friends, siblings, grandchildren, children, whatever that are dating, maybe this all is useful to all of you. The first thing that's really important, and I always bring this up with the youth at youth group, is that dating is temporary and it always ends. Dating always ends. It ends either in a breakup or in marriage. And occasionally the third, which would be untimely death. We're not going to focus on that this morning, but the other 2, definitely. Dating relationships always end in either breakup or an engagement. And so we want to be thinking about dating in terms of its temporalness. It is something that, while it might benefit us long-term in terms of maturity and development, in terms of growth, in terms of learning more about ourselves, about how to have a healthy relationship with another, it might teach us where the areas of weakness are in terms of our freedom to make choices, our responsibility for our lives. And so dating might have long-lasting benefit or consequence. The relationship itself is always temporary. And so we want to date in a way that is wise, that is strategic, that's intentional, with endings in mind. And so for that, I usually talk about 3 areas of boundary. Now, when I use the word boundary, I think some people might picture a wall or a barricade that blocks your way. When I talk about boundary, that's not what I mean. I'm talking more like those property lines. Or the analogy I often like to use is thinking of a racetrack. Boundaries on a racetrack are not in the middle of the track to block you from moving forward. They're on the sides of the track to keep you on course and to keep you from sailing off into the field next door. And so boundaries in a dating relationship or in any relationship, healthy boundaries are designed to keep us on course, to keep us going in the right trajectory, and to keep us moving forward in a healthy way, in an intentional way, maybe even in a planned way. To stretch the analogy, race courses are not just randomly located, right? They're planned and strategized and placed. So 3 boundaries that I usually talk about. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these. These are very practical parts of dating, but I think we need to spend a little bit of time for those who are looking for some practical advice on dating. And since we only get one sermon on dating, I'm going to give as much of it as I can. The first boundary I usually talk about with youth, and it usually spans most of a youth night, is a physical boundary, the physical touch boundary. In dating, as I talked about a little bit 2 weeks ago, about this idea, this pressure in our culture to be physically close, to be intimate, to have sex. Our culture seems to communicate that unless you are sleeping with somebody or having sex or been married, you aren't really a whole person or an adult. You haven't really grown up yet. So there's a huge amount of pressure to pursue relationship in that way. And some people who do feel that strong sense of pressure or shame or guilt for not having had sex yet will feel like they don't have any choice but to, right? And so we come back to that first principle. Everybody has a choice. And we need to make choices based on our values, not based on what we feel pressured to do. And so we need to have good physical boundaries. Think back to maybe times in high school. Some of you, that's easier to do than others, because for some of you, it's right now, and some of you, it's not. But imagine the couple I call the pretzel couple. Always entwined, always cuddling. I don't know what it was like in your school, in your time, but as I walked down the hallway of my school, down the one hallway where all the seniors would hang out, and I was generally in danger of my life because I was a loser. As I walked down that hallway, you would see, like person hanging out, a guy and a girl sitting on the floor. Their legs are like weirdly interlocked. Arms are like, I don't even know how they do this. And they're like always kind of physically overlapping. I call them the pretzel couple. They're always linked together, somehow always connected. In fact, as they walk down the hallway, they do this weird walk where they're like one leg over the other or something, or they might like have their arms over each other, or they have their hands. Maybe everyone's like, oh, this is so cute, right? You hold your hands down the street, and then there's like a post in the way, and you like refuse to let go, right? And you're going to run into the post because we can't let go of each other. We've got to be always physically touching. This couple has given in perhaps to a pressure as part of our culture's pressure to have a physical and intimate relationship. However, we need to beware of becoming the human pretzel couple. We need to be intentional and direct in our relationships about what is appropriate physical touch. In a dating relationship, there needs to be a conversation about what are we both comfortable with and what are our values. If our values are that we're going to wait for marriage for sexual intimacy, then we need to be talking about what is appropriate within our dating relationship. Is hand holding as physical as we're going to get? Is hugging appropriate? Where does kissing fall into this? We need to have honest and unembarrassed, or not be embarrassed, that's okay. Have honest and straight up front conversation about what is appropriate. These kind of conversations should continue into marriage, by the way, though they might take a different tone. But having conversations about what is comfortable and appropriate physically is a good thing. The second type of boundary that I focus on usually with youth is what I call the time boundary. New relationships are exciting. And what we often find is that we want to spend all of our time with that other person now. Oh, they like me. I like them. Let's never spend any time apart. Yay. This is the never separate couple, right? This is the couple that at all times they are together. If you invite one, you're getting both. If one shows up, the other one is definitely nearby. And if they're not nearby, they're constantly on their phone texting with each other or sending pictures to each other. I don't know, Snapchat's a thing that I think young people use. Don't do that. But they're constantly spending all of their time with one another. In recent years, I've started adding to this time boundary the importance of technology boundary kind of mixed into it, but maybe it needs to be its own boundary. But about how much time do you spend texting with one another and setting appropriate and intentional times for that. You see, every person needs more than one healthy relationship in their life. And dating relationships are usually not your healthiest one. But we usually need more than one relationship in our life. We all do. We need a community. We need to belong. And we have some other relationships in our life prior to us ever getting into a dating relationship. We have a relationship with our friends, with our family, with our mentors, with our church community. These relationships matter. And in the mindset of endings, these relationships matter even more. Can you imagine if you spend all of your time with the other person and you're constantly out together all the time, and even when you're not out with them, you're on your phone texting them, so you're ignoring your friend group. When that relationship comes to an end, let's say it breaks up, and you turn to your friends for support, what kind of support do you think you'll get? Probably not a whole lot of positive support. Positive for them. They'll be like, finally, about time. Or, man, we're off doing this other stuff. We made plans without you because you're never available anymore. You're always over there. Or if the relationship ends in engagement, and you turn to your friends and go, who's going to stand with me at the altar? Who's going to stand with me as witnesses to this union? Is it going to be those friends who you've ignored for the dating season, however long that was? They don't want to be there. They feel rejected and abandoned. Consider your parents, your friends, your siblings. Consider your church community. You know how often it happens in youth group where a regularly attending teenager will suddenly disappear? So I'll follow up with them. Hey, what's going on? I haven't seen you at youth group in like 3-4 weeks. What's going on? And they'll go, oh, I got a new girlfriend. It's like, oh, cool. And that's more important than coming out Friday night for like 2 hours. Like, bring her along. We would welcome her. But it's like, no, I got to spend all my time with her. And they disappear. And then when they come back, and our youth group is very focused on small groups, so they come back and they go to their small group. The small group's like, dude, you've been gone for like 5 months. We've moved forward. Where have you been? Right? Time boundary is about being intentional about the time we spend. In this area, I'm actually a big advocate of returning about 30 years into the past in terms of dating, where you actually plan dates. Where you actually, if you're a dating couple, you plan specific times, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever's appropriate for you, and you go on a date, go to dinner, go to a movie, go bowling, go do something like that. Intentionally plan out a date and set that time aside. And then be intentional about, with your person you're dating, your girlfriend or your boyfriend, that you say things like, hey, I'm hanging out with my friends on Saturday, so I'm not going to be available to hang out Saturday. And then you go and hang out with your friends, and if he texts you, you text back, hey, sorry, with my friends, I'll talk to you tomorrow. You send that, and then you put your phone away, and you hang out with your friend group. And the person you're dating needs to know this boundary. This needs to be communicated back and forth, so they get that text and go, oh, cool, awesome. I want them to have good friendships. And they put their phone away and they leave them alone and go find something to do with their day. Same thing, family dinner time, and you're on your phone texting away at the dinner table. Yeah, that's not going to go over well with your parents, probably. See, now I'm talking like I'm talking to teenagers. I hope you guys appreciate that. This is what I do at youth nights. Just realized I'm like talking like it's all youth group here. Parents don't appreciate having a kid just texting at the table. And so it's like, hey, the text needs to just be a quick, hey, having dinner with my family, talk to you later. And the other person in the relationship, having had an intentional conversation about appropriate time boundaries, is going to be able to say, oh, good, awesome. Put their phone away, leave them alone. Let them have their time with their family. Because who's going to matter as you go through life? Your family will matter. No matter how the dating relationship ends, your other friendships, family, mentors, they will matter throughout your whole life and should not be ignored. And so cell phones count as time. That's why I keep mentioning the texting thing. Cell phones count as time. How we utilize our cell phones in our relationship matters. How we use our time in relationships matters. The third type of boundary that I usually talk about is the spiritual boundary. A spiritual boundary. Now, this one ties back in again to making choices based on our values. But this boundary, I usually call it an accountability boundary. One of the most important relationships you have in your life is your relationship with God. So this boundary is about making that relationship at the highest priority. This is, again, one of those things, all boundaries require that we talk with the other person and come to an agreement about where we stand, but what the values in our relationship will be. These are conversations we should be having in our marriages, with our kids perhaps, and especially in our romantic relationships in the dating stage. And so we have this intentional and meaningful conversation. This is the highest priority for me, is my relationship with God. What does that look like for us as a couple? Does that mean we're going to hold each other accountable to regular attendance at church or youth programs? Does this mean we will hold each other accountable to regular Bible study and devotional times? Does this mean we'll spend time in prayer together? Have we set aside time where we can each be mentored, either as a couple or as individuals, to deepen our own spiritual lives and our depth of understanding and relationship with Jesus? Chris, when he talks about marriage, usually talks about that final day when you'll stand before God and present your spouse to God as someone who you have walked alongside for their sake, that they might become a whole and complete person under God. That's what this is about. How are we working together to strengthen and deepen one another's relationship with the God of the universe? Because ultimately, this relationship is temporary, but our relationship with God is eternal. And so we support each other in our Christian journey. And so we need to have an honest conversation about what that looks like in our relationship. So we keep an eye on the eternal. The person you are dating or even married to, or the child you're raising, they're not yours. Ultimately, they belong to God. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. You also are God's. You belong to God. So let us not be turned away by the infatuations of dating. Dating is ultimately a unique relationship that ends in either marriage or breakup. It's an experimental relationship that has low commitment. Thus, the young couple must carefully and wisely enter into these relationships with thoughtfulness and care, with good conversation, asking hard questions about where our values are in terms of a physical relationship, in terms of the amount of time that we will spend, and our relationship with God. Far too often, I've worked with young people who, driven by a lust of the flesh, pursue relationship for their own gain. They view the relationship as a means for personal pleasure or fulfillment, and the other person in the relationship is simply an object for their personal gain. This is selfish and childish and denies the image of God. There are some in the past couple decades who, in light of that danger that I just outlined, suggest that we should just throw dating away, get rid of it. There are others who decide that dating is not a Christian task. And in fairness, you're not going to find a whole lot of details on dating in the Bible. But I think there's a third way, and that is to have God-honoring relationships, to enter dating with maturity, to risk something of ourselves for the sake of another, entering into a relationship, taking responsibility for ourselves, holding on to our freedom to choose. And in this, we develop important life skills. We develop maturity in a way that only relationships can. The type of maturity that develops not through rule following, as Colossians 2 suggests. I worded that weird. In Colossians 2, Paul makes clear that just following rules does not transform the heart. He suggests that deep relationship is what transforms the heart, specifically relationship with God. He says it this way. Let's just read it. It's open here. I just got to find the starting verse. I think it's 20. If you died with Christ to the elements of this world, why do you live as if you still belong to the world? Why do you submit to regulations? Don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. All these regulations refer to what is destined to perish. It's temporary by being used up. They are human commands and doctrines, although these have a reputation for wisdom by promoting self-made religion, false humility, and severe treatment of the body. They are not of any value in curbing self-indulgence. Rule following does not change the maturity and the depth of the heart. Rather, it is in relationship with Christ, dying to self, or as he says in verse 20, dying with Christ, entering into deep and meaningful relationship with the God of the universe, with others around us, and even willing to risk letting light shine in our own lives and into the dark parts of our own lives so we might have healthy relationship within ourselves. This is how we develop maturity. Dating is one of those types of relationships that can allow us to do this and is probably worth the risk, but should not be done lightly, flippantly, or without great care. Let me pray and we'll be done there. Lord God, we thank you that you are a God of relationship, that you in your own being embody and encapsulate relationship in your Trinitarian essence. And out of your own nature, you created relational people. Lord, I pray that you would give us the courage and the wisdom to risk entering real and meaningful relationship with one another. Give us the courage, Lord, to step into those scary and difficult places. And Lord, give us the humility to allow your light to shine in the dark parts of our life. Praise in your name. Amen.